Okay, so on to the main agenda for the evening. And with that, I will turn it over to our panel moderator, Heather Harris.
Thanks, Jay. We're so excited to have you all here. Thanks to our panelists. Very excited, as Marguerite said, as we are all experiencing this very dry start to the year. I know this is a topic top of mind that we're all really interested just to learn more about and educate ourselves on. So happy to have you here. Just a few notes about the format, and then we'll dive right in. Just wanted to mention to please go ahead, and as you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I will do my best to monitor and then moderate those questions at the end. So our speakers are each gonna speak to us for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and we'll plan to hold questions till the end so we can hopefully have a nice discussion. So while you're writing your question, if it is directed for a specific speaker, please just try and indicate who that is so I can be sure to direct that to the right person. And yeah, I think I mentioned we'll try and hold Q&A to the end. So I think with that, we are going to one last point, sorry. As Jay just mentioned, we're recording the call just so everyone's aware of that, and it will be sent out to those of you who registered via Zoom. So with that, I will introduce our first panelist, Clifford C. Chan, who was appointed to serve as the 11th General Manager of the East Bay Municipal Utility District in June of 2020. He manages an organization with 2,000 employees and a $1 billion annual budget to support a 7-member publicly elected board of directors. As the General Manager, he balances the continued demands of maintaining our critical infrastructure and financial stability with innovation and sustainability and long-term water and watershed planning. Mr. Chan has worked for more than 23 years with the district, and prior to that, he worked for 4 years as a consulting engineer working on a variety of environmental and geotechnical projects. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Clifford.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Jay, for having me on the panel tonight. And yeah, I was asked, I'm going to get less into the climate change aspects of what we do, and I was asked to really provide some background about East Bay MUD and where your water comes from, our water supply outlook, and then, of course, what you can do to conserve water and how we can help out. So let me pull up my presentation. Does everyone see the presentation? Very good. So, I want to start by talking a bit about our history in the East Bay, because, many of the people who built and maintain our water system also built the communities that we live in here today. So in about a year, East Bay MUD is going to turn 100. And I like this slide because it shows me what things look like 100 years ago, and then who we are today, and especially the employees who keep East Bay MUD running. But it also makes me think about the water companies that came before East Bay MUD. So the first water systems in the East Bay started popping up around the mid-1800s, over a half a century before East Bay MUD was formed. The communities grew really where water was most accessible. And it started with this man. This is Anthony Chabot. He was born in Quebec. He came to the United States, first to the Mississippi, then he went to mining in the gold mines in California. And finally, he came to the East Bay, where he started the Contra Costa Water Company. The Contra Costa Water Company, they built Lake Temescal, it's kind of a rendering on the upper right, and also Chabot Reservoir on the bottom right to supply water to their customers. Now, the Contra Costa Water Company wasn't the only water company in the area. There were other smaller water companies. I was doing a little research to find out where the water in the Diamond District originally came from. And what I found was, around the mid-1800s, Henderson Llewellyn, he had planted hundreds of trees along Sausal Creek on his property, and he called it a fruit vale. A bit later, Hugh Diamond, he was a gold prospector. He also bought property along Sausal Creek. But before Hugh Diamond came to the area, Caspar Hopkins formed the Sausal Creek Water Company to supply water to this growing area. Now, Hopkins built a dam right at the intersection of, I guess, what we know as Park Boulevard and Highway 13. And he piped that water down to a reservoir on the road that we know as Waterhouse Road, which is, I think, just on the edge of the Diamond District. Now, I mentioned this because the Salsa Creek Water Company was eventually purchased by the Contra Costa Water Company. So in the early 1900s, the Contra Costa Water Company merged with the People's Water Company, which was run by Frank C. Havens. I'm going to guess that most of you don't recognize who Frank C. Havens is. But before he ran the People's Water Company, he was a developer, and he was responsible for building many of the communities in East Bay, including the Crocker Highlands. He was also the developer of the Claremont Hotel. Now, the other thing that the People's Water Company is known for is they were responsible for bringing water meters to the East Bay. Before the People's Water Company, we didn't measure how much water people use. Instead, we charged them by the number of fixtures in their home, as well as the number of people in their home. After the 1906 earthquake, the population of Oakland doubled in about a year as people moved from San Francisco to Oakland. And so to supply all these new customers, the People's Water Company built Central Reservoir, which, if you look on a map, is just outside the northwest corner of the Diamond District. And just to give you a sense of the size of Central Reservoir, this is Memorial Stadium in the footprint of the reservoir. But, you know, the People's Water Company was having financial problems and was eventually taken over by the East Bay Water Company, and that's not to be confused with East Bay Mud. And to meet the growing demand, the East Bay Water Company built San Pablo Reservoir, and they also built Upper San Leandro Reservoir. But ultimately, East Bay Water Company also began to struggle. In fact, the dozens of water companies that formed in the East Bay since the mid-1800s failed largely because they were unable to provide a reliable water supply, maintain water quality, or keep water affordable. So in the early 1920s, California passed the Municipal Utility District Act, or MUD Act. And then in 1923, the people of the East Bay voted to form East Bay MUD as a not-for-profit government agency. And the photo on the right, or left, sorry, that's Arthur Powell Davis. He was the first general manager and chief engineer for East Bay MUD. And his first task was to find a reliable water source. So he brought in Major General George Washington Goethals on the upper right, and William Mulholland on the bottom right. Goethals was the person behind the construction of the Panama Canal, and Mulholland is the father of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And so together they looked at various water supplies in the Sierra. They looked at the Eel, the Upper Sacramento, the Tuolumne, and the McCullumne, and eventually they settled on the McCullumne. So by 1929, Pardee Dam was completed, and this is a photo of Pardee Dam. If you kind of look on the bottom left and then kind of towards the top, you'll see the spillway. At the time, it was the tallest concrete arch dam in the world. And so really, I guess what I'm trying to say is the story of East Bay MUD is about how water was developed in the East Bay to support all of the growing communities. And you know, there are places named after the people who built our water systems. If you think of Chabot Space and Science Center, or Chabot College, or Berryman Street in Berkeley, or Pardee House, these are the people who built the water systems in the East Bay. So the question is, where did your water come from? And you know, I saw a survey a few years ago I thought was pretty interesting, and they asked people, where do you think your water comes from? 25% of people got it right, 50% had no clue, and 25% got it wrong. In fact, there were some people, when they asked, who said that their water came from their faucet, which technically, I guess, is correct, but certainly not the answer people were looking for. So in the next 3 slides, I'm going to tell you where your water comes from. So 90% of our water comes from the McCullumne watershed in the Sierra Nevada. That water is stored in one of 2 Sierra reservoirs. Our main drinking water reservoir is Pardee Reservoir. The water travels 90 miles from Pardee in 3 aqueducts across the delta and terminates in Walnut Creek. The water from the aqueducts can be stored in any one of our 5 local reservoirs, and that water can also be treated in any one of our 6 water treatment plants. Now, the water from the treatment plants are then stored in any one of 164 drinking water reservoirs or tanks. The water from the tanks can supply our customers by gravity, or they have to be pumped up into the hills through any one of 125 pumping plants. And connecting all these facilities to our customers are about 4,200 miles of pipe under just about every street in the East Bay. We supply water to 1.4 million customers in Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and our service area covers about 325 square miles. That's 7 times larger than San Francisco. We're the second largest water retailer in California and the 12th largest in the nation. In 1951, we began treating wastewater for a smaller portion of our service area, and that's that hashed area that you see on the map. Our main wastewater treatment plant is located at the foot of the Bay Bridge. And before we started treating all the sewage, all that sewage that the customers flushed down the toilet or down the drain went directly to the San Francisco Bay. So before I talk about our water supply outlook for this year, let me talk a bit about last year. And that's important because how much water we carry over from one year to the next is an important factor in our decision making. So from a precipitation standpoint, 2021 was the driest on record in the East Bay and the second driest in the McCollum. As a result, East Bay MUD declared a stage 1 drought last April, and we asked our customers to voluntarily conserve 10% of their water use. We also began operation of our Freeport facility. Now, the Freeport facility was a huge investment that we made and all of our customers made to improve our drought resilience. The intake facility that you see in the upper right photo is located on the Sacramento River, just downstream of the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers. Now, as part of our drought declaration, we began operation of the Freeport facility last year to supplement our water supplies. So this year actually started out great. You heard Director Young talk about that, and this chart shows how much precipitation we received to date, and then in the kind of the boxes, the average rainfall we get each month. And so you remember the atmospheric storms that we got in October and December, and everything looked good, but then the spigot went dry, and we've had very little precipitation in January and February, and it's looking like January and February will turn out to be the driest combined 2 months on record. Now, this table here shows what our water supply looks like as of February 17th. And I would say generally our water supply is okay right now. We're about 91% of average for this time of the year. The biggest hole is in Comanche Reservoir, which is also one of our reservoirs located in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Comanche isn't a drinking water reservoir, but it's used for flood control and for providing environmental flows and fishery flows. Water utilities, we measure our volumes in terms of acre feet. And so if you can imagine an acre of land and you put 1 foot of water on it, that's an acre foot. That's about 326,000 gallons. So you can see our current storage is 529,000 gallons. And also to maybe put things in perspective, 1 acre foot is enough water to supply the average water use of 4 homes for a year in our service area. So we don't have a crystal ball that will tell us how much rain we're going to get for the rest of the year. So what we do with our water supply projections, we look at different scenarios. And the first scenario is a wet scenario, or the 10 percentile, which means 1 out of 10 years are wetter. That's that top blue line. Now we also look at a median forecast and the 90th percentile, which means 9 out of 10 years are wetter. So that's the dry scenario. And those are the 2 dashed, the green and red dashed lines. And we take this information and we project how much storage we'll have at the end of the water year, and the water year ends on September 30th. So looking at this graph for 2022, if we get median or better precipitation for the remainder of the year, we'll be in good shape. If it stays dry, we'll still be okay with 470,000 acre feet of water, but we'd still be in a stage 1 drought. But I will say 470,000 acre feet is more storage than we ended with last year. I'll just touch on how we do our water supply planning a bit. We know that climate change and changing regulations is just going to put more pressure on the McCollum, our Freeport supplies, and the East Bay watershed. And so that's why we put together a long-term water supply plan. And we really focus on building a diverse water supply portfolio that includes water transfers, recycled water, adding additional surface water storage, groundwater, as well as looking at regional partnerships. Part of that portfolio is that we also want our customers to conserve water. And our portfolio includes water conservation. And since we started our water conservation program several decades ago, our customers have saved about 44 million gallons per day. Our goal is to increase our water conservation to 70 million gallons per day by 2050. But in a drought, in addition to water conservation, we may ask our customers, and we have this year, to save some more water. And our messaging is pretty simple. The first one is irrigate efficiently. You can save most of the water of your water by being careful about your outdoor irrigation. The next one is to find and fix leaks. Small toilet leaks, for example, can waste a lot of water. And the last one is to be mindful of indoor use. To just give you an example, if every one of our customers took 1 less minute in the shower, that would save about 3 million gallons of water per day. And that's a lot of water. Now, this is something that confuses our customers a lot, but when we ask for a 10% reduction, that's a district-wide goal. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to save 10%, and it doesn't mean that you have to save 10% every day of the year. For example, we have irrigation customers. They can save more water than a single-family home. And for a single-family home, we know that you can save more water in the summer than you can in the winter. And during a drought, we often get customers, that are already conserving a lot, saying, "Look, I'm saving a lot of water. There's nothing more for me to give." And the reality is, some customers, residential customers, can conserve more, and some can conserve less. And so, if you're a homeowner and you're already using about 45 gallons per capita per day or less, our message is keep up the good work. Just some tools that we have to help our customers learn about how they can conserve water. We have webinars on smart landscaping. We also hold open office hours and that you can join and ask water conservation questions. Our website has lots of resources on how you can be smarter about using water at home and at work. You can also sign up for our Water Smart report and apply for rebates. Speaking of the Water Smart report, if you do sign up, you can get a home water report that shows how much water you use and how your usage compares to similar homes in the area. We also pass out information materials at events on how you can save water. Another benefit for signing up for the Water Smart reports is you can get water alerts. So we'll let you know if we think you have a leak in your home, for instance. We also offer many rebates, including a lawn replacement program that we recently doubled the per square foot replacement amount. We also have a rebate for a flow meter that you can install on your water meter to give you higher frequency data on your water use. We have clothes washer rebates and rebates for irrigation equipment like smart irrigation timers. And we also give away free low flow shower heads, aerators, and spray nozzles that have a shutoff valve. We also know that a lot of our customers aren't account holders, and so we're doing more outreach to homeowners associations and customers that live in multifamily residential units that don't get a water bill. So I'll just close by saying, there's a lot of things that you can do to save water, and we have a lot of resources for you to help you save water. And our website is really a great resource for you.
Thank you so much, Clifford. That was great. I learned so much, and I think, realized how much we take our infrastructure for granted. It does just seem to come out of the faucet. So thank you for that. We got a few questions. We'll hold those to the end to make sure we have enough time for other speakers to speak as well. So next up is Annabelle Rosser. She's a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. She has a background in urban and environmental planning and studies a range of water policy issues, including drought monitoring, urban water management, water finance, and environmental land use planning. She has a bachelor's degree from University of Chicago and a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of California, Los Angeles. So I'll hand it over to Annabelle.
Cool, thanks, Heather. Let me share my slides. Thank you all for having me again. My name is Annabelle Rosser. I'm a research associate at the Water Policy Center. If you have follow-up questions in addition to the Q&A, my email is listed here. At the end, I'll also encourage you all to look at some other resources on our website. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the wider California statewide picture of urban drought policy, thinking about our current drought conditions within that context. So, okay. So first, I have a little bit of an overview, actually some charts similar to what Clifford showed, about what we're looking at so far as drought conditions in California right now. And then a little bit about how cities statewide have responded, and then giving a little bit of context for how we plan for and manage droughts in urban communities in California, including different planning mechanisms, as well as where some of our funding for drought prep and responses come from. So first things first, obviously, I always think it's really important to remember that California's climate is a variable one. And with climate change, we expect it to become even more so over time. So preparing and making sure our system is able to handle extremes is increasingly important. If you look at this first chart, you can see that California fluctuates between wet and dry years pretty much historically. And this has gotten more extreme, whereas we've had longer periods of dry years in periods of drought in the past like 30 years or so. What makes this even more difficult to manage is how temperature has increased to rise at the same time. So when you have spikes in temperature, it increases in temperature when you also have dry years. It makes it more difficult to manage drought for a few reasons, mainly because of what it does to demand and how much moisture gets sucked out of our system due to evapotranspiration. So when it's hotter, you can think you probably have to irrigate or water your lawn more. The same goes for the crops in our ag fields. And so demand tends to spike, and the water that we have doesn't go as far. If you're looking at the last 2 years specifically, like Clifford mentioned, these are some of the driest and warmest on record. So if you're looking at the entire state of California, from 2019 to 2021, we saw the second driest period on record, really only a little bit wetter than one of the worst drought periods in the 70s the state has seen. And then it was also the third warmest. And it's similar in a lot of ways to the conditions that we saw during the previous drought, and really a few years into the previous drought. And I think this is worth mentioning just because it indicates how quickly we're seeing really extreme conditions this time around. It's taken us a little like a year and a half to get to a similar place that we were conditions-wise in the last drought that took about 3 years to get there. So we're really living in this bottom right-hand quadrant at the moment. That's not to say there isn't still some hope. So this is really similar to the figure that Clifford showed earlier. But back in the fall of last year, we were projecting some future scenarios to see what the state might look like in the following year. There are 3 different scenarios here. I won't spend too much time with this, but like Clifford just mentioned, a really, really wet year would pull us out of drought. An above normal year would bring us into slightly better conditions, but we would still be just below a level of normal. And a dry year similar to what we saw in 2015 would keep us in a state of at least hydrologic severe drought. In the last couple of months, following the atmospheric rivers that we had towards the end or the early winter, the end of last year, we've had a really dry January and February. So this is how it's looking in comparison. And I think it's worth mentioning, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look right at October, we were actually in a better scenario than we were in the same time in 2014. But because we've had such a record-breaking dry beginning of this year, it's sort of dipped even below what we saw in 2015. And that is not to say we will still see what happens in the rest of this winter, but that's how we're tracking so far. So it makes sense for us to prepare for another year of drought. We're already doing a lot to conserve statewide. So in July, the governor requested a voluntary 15% conservation across the state. This is in contrast to previous mandates that were mandatory conservation asks. Given the voluntary nature of this, looking at the data, about Californians statewide have conserved about 6% of their water use. However, we think it's really important, given some of the work me and my colleagues have been doing on this, to remember that the most impacted regions are actually meeting or sometimes superseding this 15% conservation goal. And a lot of that is because a voluntary conservation ask allows local agencies to implement conservation metrics that match what their local conditions are feeling and what their own localized planning has sort of planned out for them to do. And so you've seen these communities in the blue in the central and south coasts conserving quite a bit more than urban communities throughout the rest of the state. The other thing that I think is important to consider here is that baseline water use has really shifted to what it was like in the previous drought. So we've been consistently improving our water efficiency over time. Californians have been using, in general, less water, even as we've expanded our population. Water use has never really fully rebounded to what it was before the 2012-2016 drought. And a lot of that is thanks to really great investments in water use efficiency. It also means that for some people, if you have already conserved quite a bit, it's really difficult to conserve more. And so there's just a little bit less wiggle room. That's not to say that there is not still conservation that can be done though. I think this is interesting to share just because it tells another story. So part of PPIC's team is a survey team that polls public opinion on a variety of policy issues. And one thing that's been really clear to us in the past year is that the pandemic and other public issues have really taken top priority on Californians' minds. And so in comparison to the last drought, where water issues, conservation, drought supplies, things like that was really one of the top most important issues to California. This chart shows that. So this blue line tracks what percentage of Californians are naming water as the most important issue facing the state over time. That really peaked at the height of the last drought. And if you look at September of last year, it's really not on track to what it was like in the previous drought. That's not to say it's not important to Californians, but there are a lot of other competing concerns that people are facing at the moment, the pandemic obviously being one. With that said, I do think it's important to add a little bit of optimism here. So generally, especially compared to other sectors across the state, cities are really well positioned to cope with drought impacts. Last year, they were in a pretty good spot. This year, as drought persists, there is some concern about certain things, but generally speaking, since the last drought and during the last drought, a lot of cities were able to make investments in their supply reliability and reduce demand with long-term conservation goals. And both of those things pay off when we face another drought. Short-term conservation actions in times of crisis also still contribute to the overall resilience of our system. But then we also have new drought planning requirements that have been implemented since the previous drought that help give local agencies even more information to make decisions based on the local conditions they're facing. I'll speak a little bit more to that in a second. So since the 80s, following a pretty severe drought in the 70s, urban water suppliers have been required to make something called an urban water management plan. And this is a lot of things, but it's the primary document that's really going to respond and plan for drought at the local level. Following the previous drought, a number of requirements were made to these documents, and all of them were produced in the latest round of these plans, which were published last year. This included things like developing a water shortage contingency plan that was uniform with the rest of the agencies across the state, incorporating things like seismic risk and utilities into drought planning, having a supply and demand drought risk assessment on an annual basis so that urban utilities know what they're doing. This isn't to say that urban utilities weren't doing this before this was required, but this makes it so that all urban agencies are meeting these requirements. And these really interact with other local and state considerations. So in addition to the urban water management plan, this figure to the right here is actually from San Diego's urban water management plan. It applies to all urban agencies, but I think it's a useful picture and way to think about the way these different agencies interact together to plan for drought. And so you have the urban water management plan as kind of the primary guiding document, but then there are other ways that state agencies, the public, and cities can complement, supplement, and contribute to drought planning and responses. So the one main point I think is worth really hitting home as well is that urban agencies have been able to make a lot of investments in their resiliency. And this is something that really sets urban agencies apart from other sectors, is they have the revenue and the ability often to make these investments, to build out things like surface and underground storage, improve regional water grid interconnections so that you can build regional resilience across different agencies, invest in things like recycled wastewater and stormwater centers, and then invest in water transfers in the water market. And it's important to note that a lot of the money to do these things comes from the water bills that you pay. I think most people are surprised to realize that the bulk of our water system is funded by local sources. So we, as a state, spend around $37 billion each year on our water supplies, and the lion's share of that comes from local sources. More than half of that is going towards a variety of water supply issues, including a lot of drought planning. But you should pat yourselves on the back because a lot of that is coming from your water bill, and we would not have the type of funding we did without those local resources. The state and federal agencies contribute a little bit, but the bulk is coming from local resources. And speaking of the state and the feds, while the bulk is coming from local resources, recently especially, we've had a few different influxes of funding directed specifically to things like drought infrastructure, drought planning, emergency response, things like that. So in the last state budget, we had a surplus. We had a ton of money set aside for different water issues, water supply reliability, and immediate drought relief being two big portions of the water spending in that bill, in that budget. And then the latest infrastructure bill that came out of Washington sets aside about $8 billion for Western water infrastructure. And not all of it is coming directly to California, but much of it will. So with that, the main takeaways, if you remembered nothing from the previous slides, is we're planning for drought in a time of climate change, and that means variability. We're likely to see conditions persist, but cities are well positioned to cope given the investments that they've made up until now. That is not to say that short-term conservation is not really useful to help the whole system cope through these conditions. And thank your local agencies, because they're doing the bulk of the urban drought management and conservation planning. At the same time, like sometimes the state can play a supplementary role. And so if you have opinions about that, definitely weigh in when things like, we'll likely have another budget surplus this year. It'll be interesting to see if there's additional funds coming from the state as drought conditions persist. So keep attuned to that as well. That's all I have. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. That was, again, great and filled with a ton of new information for me, so thank you. So we move on to our last speaker, and keep on submitting those questions in the Q&A box as we go along here. Excuse me. So Dr. Erica Siirila, I knew I was going to pronounce her name wrong. I practiced too. Woodburn is a research scientist and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory with a focus on computational hydrology. She and her group study the movement and partitioning of water in natural and managed environments, with recent topics including climate change and extremes, groundwater, storage dynamics, wildfires, and quantitative risk assessment. Erica received her PhD in hydrology from the Colorado School of Mines in 2013 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Polytechnic University of Barcelona before joining the Berkeley lab in 2015. So thank you, and apologies, Erica, take it away.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. And for everyone, joining on, presumably in your free time to learn about these topics. It's really, encouraging, I guess the word is, to see folks, interested in this. So I think what I'll focus on today is, I think we heard a little bit about the past, about our current situation, and I think I'll mostly focus on the future, and specifically with a lens thinking about water in the Western US, connected to snowpack and why snow is important, how it's changing, and what it really means for the greater hydrologic cycle, and eventually water resources. So yeah, this is kind of mostly based on a recent study that we led at a Berkeley lab, and so that involved a long list of co-authors that are shown here. Okay, so to start, I really want to think about snowpack in general, and talk about snowpack loss. And so folks might not be aware, but snowpack loss is already occurring across the Western US due to climate change, as well as other places across the globe. And in Western US, it's actually occurring at pretty considerable rates. So this figure by Moat and co-authors has shown that peak Western US winter snow water equivalent, or SWE, which is simply the amount of water held in a given snowpack, that's traditionally measured on April 1st of each year. That value has been declining since about the mid-1950s in over 90% of stations, and that the amount of decline is pretty significant, on the order of a 23% change. So to put that into perspective, 23% decline in SWE is roughly equivalent to the largest surface water reservoir in the Western US, which is Lake Mead. So we're really talking about massive amounts of water loss, and depending on that timeline of continued and future loss, you can really have potentially catastrophic impacts on Western US water management. And I don't use that word catastrophic lightly, so this will kind of describe why that might be. So water is managed in the Western US really based around the assumption of a reliable snowpack. And we put this figure together to show how cities, agriculture, energy grids all utilize infrastructure which was historically constructed around this assumption of a reliable snowpack. So the figure on the left shows the median snowpack conditions in the kind of blue shading based on a publicly available snow product. We've overlaid the major river networks as blue lines and scaled those by the size of the river. We also have connections to reservoirs, scaled by magnitude as well, and then overlaid on top of that some of the major water conveyance infrastructure, that some of which we heard about earlier, things like aqueducts or pipelines as these kind of red lines. You can see California kind of pops out in that regard. On the figure on the right shows the connection of really a hybrid human and natural system with the major sectors which really rely on the movement of water from the mountains to the end users. And the end users can be things like hydropower, agriculture, and of course for people in metropolitan areas. So reliance on snowpack for water resources is, is very much true for California specifically. And so I think it's helpful to compare water storage in man-made reservoirs with the water stored in seasonal snowpacks, which is what we're showing here. So the figure on the left is showing how in California, April 1st SWE, which are the sort of teal, the highest color on each of those bar graphs, how that major reservoir water storage in those reservoirs compares to, the amount of snow stored in the Sierra compared to the major reservoirs. I got that backwards, which are the dark blue colors, and then the smallest reservoirs are the lightest blue color. And in total, there's about 148 other reservoirs in the state. So relatively speaking, SWE accounts for an additional 72% of additional water storage. And so the point being here is that snow really is this vast natural reservoir that we have come to rely on, both in terms of water supply and seasonal storage. And I'll talk about that seasonal storage a little bit more. on this slide. So we have to also make considerations thinking about how warmer temperatures in the future of warmer temperatures and less snow, that can also mean earlier snow melt. So one study in the literature recently showed that peak snow melt is actually occurring 2 days earlier per decade in most locations across the Western US, or said another way, up to 8 days earlier per degree Celsius of warming. And this simple schematic basically shows how historically many winter wet and summer dry regions like California essentially use the melting of winter snowpack to bridge the gap between when water supply and when water demand occurs. And concerningly, as you get snow melt happening earlier in the year, you essentially get a further disconnection of these 2 points in time. And so what that means is that water shortages may actually occur earlier in the year, and they may be more substantial. So when can we expect this transition of more substantial snowpack to occur? How can we prepare for potential water failures due to these shifts in snowpack given a warmer climate? So this is the study I mentioned earlier that we let out of Berkeley lab. It was a Nature Review article, and if folks are interested in reading this, I think I can share that PDF with you, so please reach out to me personally for a copy of it if you're interested in looking at it. It was really a fantastic group of interdisciplinary researchers ranging from climate scientists to water managers, including folks from Denver Water, people, geochemists, hydrologists, meteorologists, who have all been thinking about snowpack loss and coming at it from different kind of perspectives to put this in sort of a more concise framework and to sort of confront the issue sort of akin to other natural climate change disasters like wildfires or sea level rise, to really elevate the message of snowpack loss. So this is one of the kind of staple findings of that study. Essentially what we did was look to the literature in over 300 peer-reviewed journal articles and pulled data from any analyses which gave us enough information in terms of snowpack disappearance and timing of disappearance that we could perform a meta-analysis on to better constrain the timeline of snowpack loss. And you can see the results of that sort of animating over different regions on the right for 3 main time periods of the future. So these are based on model projections where we know essentially, or we're assuming some amount of emissions continue or are curbed, and we can then quantify how much snow water equivalent or snowpack water that's stored in the snow is essentially going to be changing relative to historical conditions. And in general, kind of Western US wide, you see about a 25% decline by 2050 and up to 50%, and on the order of 50% decline by 2100, and up to, in some regions, like I'm just showing there in the Sierra, up to 80% by end of century. And the range here is kind of important, of course, and that's due to sort of availability of data, different methods used, different physical responses to a warming climate, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but also different metrics and also different emission scenarios. So, you know, rightly so, there is a range, but in general, you see this change looking towards the future. So I mentioned there that the coastal regions and Sierras, based on the analysis, do look to be hit harder than, say, the interior ranges. And so why is that? 2 primary reasons that we point to in the study. First, much of the Sierra Nevada and the Cascades are really around, at or around freezing level. And so what that means is slight changes in precipitation and temperature, will essentially mean that more precipitation is falling in the form of rain as opposed to snow. And essentially that means that you're pushing the freezing line further upslope much more easily. The second thing is that the coastal regions are much more prone to intermittent and extreme precipitation events. And we heard about that already tonight. You know, the occurrence of atmospheric rivers is becoming more and more, I guess, acknowledged as really a driver of annual precipitation totals, where in much of the coastal regions of the Western US, it can drive up to 50% of precipitation in just order of a handful of days. So these atmospheric rivers essentially are, storms derived from the tropics, and have, more warmer characteristics, which also lead to things like rain on snow events. So it's kind of another aspect to how precipitation falls in these coastal regions, opposed to the interior ranges. So unfortunately, it's not really as simple as understanding just when snowpack might be diminished or eventually even disappear. Although I think, hopefully you've gotten a sense that that itself is not a trivial pursuit, and looking to the climate models is one of the best tools we have. But there's also another kind of consideration to thinking about what it means for water resources, and that is how do those changes in snowpack cascade? How do they propagate onto the landscape? I'm a hydrologist, so this is really where my interest lies, thinking about how when you change one thing in the system, say snowpack, how that might impact vegetation species and regrowth over time, how that impacts stream flow, groundwater, if you have more high elevation wildfires, if you have changes in your radiation and solar budget because you have less snowpack. And I think Annabelle talked about the kind of importance of evapotranspiration. So that's quite literally just the amount of water that's moving back to the atmosphere that we know would certainly increase in a warmer climate. And so as all these things are changing together and co-evolving together, it's really difficult to infer kind of what that means for something like stream flow out of a reservoir, out of a mountain region. And so we pointed to kind of this cross-scale framework where thinking about snowpack loss really becomes this multidisciplinary, multi-scale problem ranging from continental to local scales. And I'm not going to go through all the details here of some of the important considerations, but really that there needs to be more connections, I guess, between traditionally isolated disciplines, like the folks here are doing tonight, and really tackling this not just in terms of our own research agendas or water management agendas, but really doing it together. And so we point in the paper to the need for this desiloing of the kind of low to no snow problem, if we want to build resilience around future climate change and future snowpack loss. So that is a bit depressing. And so it's not our hope to scare people or, to make this very doom and gloom. And of course, there are things that can be done in terms of emissions, both locally and globally, to offset some of these changes. And there's several blueprints in terms out there in terms of sort of curbing these emissions, things like investing in renewables, commitment to carbon neutrality. And I think in California, we're really leading the way for some of these efforts. So it is encouraging to see that some of these changes in snowpack loss might be more easily mitigated with more concerted efforts. But should, these emissions continue and we do see warmer temperatures, which impact the character of these storms and the persistence of snowpacks, there's several things that we outlined that can be done, many of which were already brought up tonight, which is fantastic, but an array of kind of options within a diverse portfolio of water management, things like investing in water conservation, investing in new water techniques, whether it's desalination, forest management, infrastructure, both soft and hard, and looking towards the research community for kind of knowledge gaps as well. And so just really briefly, there's kind of four main arenas where we point to potentials for resilience building, again being proactive essentially instead of reactive to this concept about snow loss and the subsequent impacts on the hydrology. So I think what comes to mind to people is maybe hard infrastructure, that has some advantages, some disadvantages, including, expense and timelines. The second thing is using existing infrastructure in new and unique ways, like forecast-informed reservoir operations, where you're essentially managing a reservoir in ways that are less, that are more informed by forecasting abilities of when a big potential atmospheric river might come through. New water, so I mentioned earlier, desal, forest management, essentially minimizing that flux of evapotranspiration up to the atmosphere by removing some vegetation within the Sierra Nevada, which is could be mutually beneficial for wildfire prevention as well, or other things like cloud seeding, potable, non-potable water reuse. And then finally, demand, which I think we heard a bit about earlier. So yeah, we kind of point to this no silver bullet slogan, and I think that that's true from the previous speakers as well, that it's probably a portfolio of these different approaches should this become our reality. But our hope is really, again, just to create more awareness around this topic and to get folks interested and really to invest in those regions in kind of the continuum of where snow interacts with hydrology to be better prepared. And so here's my email, and yeah, happy to share that paper if folks are interested, and happy to take any questions too.
Thanks so much, Erica. That was great, and loved hearing all the ideas about the future, and it does bring some optimism back into the conversation. So thank you. Some good questions have come in. I'll try and group them together if I can. The first set, I think Erica mentioned desalination. So there were a few questions, I think, geared a little bit towards Clifford. Why aren't we building desalination plants now? Is that something we should be doing? On a related note, if EBMUD were to pursue that, where would the salty brine be discharged? And then finally, if EBMUD were to purchase one of those, how would that be financed?
It's a lot of good questions. Desalination is something that we've looked at EBMUD, and we're focusing on, well, desalination is very energy intensive, and there's that brine that you talked about you have to deal with. And so when we looked at that portfolio that I showed, we're pursuing the things that we think are more cost effective, like recycled water. I mean, we do have our wastewater treatment plant that does have water that's being, we could potentially use. Just to put it in perspective, when you look at the water from Pardee, how much it costs to treat Pardee water per acre foot, it varies between $20 to $100 per acre foot. When you look at desalination, you're getting up to about $8,000 per acre foot to treat that water. There's a significant difference in cost. So as we look at how do we build a resilient portfolio, how do we also make our water supply affordable for our customers? Because we have a very varied service area with some very poor disadvantaged communities, with some very wealthy communities. And it's a balance that we have to take of making sure that we don't run out of water, but that we also keep our water affordable. So desalination is something we looked at, but really our focus right now is on recycled water.
Great, thanks for that. Next, maybe an open question to the panel. What agencies serve or regulate agricultural water use, since ag is such a large consumer of water in our state?
I could speak to that a little bit or take a first stab at that. So following the last drought, the primary water source that agriculture, I would say, uses is our groundwater. And since the previous drought, we've made some pretty significant strides in regulating California's groundwater. We're one of the only states in the United States that has started regulating its groundwater. And so this drought is a really interesting test to see how well that works. I could send some additional resources that really get into the nitty-gritty about SGMA. It's SGMA, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But the short soundbite, I guess, about how that works is that throughout the agricultural regions of California now, you have regional groundwater sustainability agencies that are developing plans similar in some ways to urban water management plans for how those agricultural districts are planning to stop overdrafting their groundwater, including things like making different investments in efficiency, potentially taking or taking some agricultural land out of irrigation, or swapping out products, different things like that. But that is kind of the regulatory apparatus that is now looking at agricultural water use. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a direction as to where to go. But if you're interested in learning more about that, we've done a ton of work in the Central Valley specifically around SGMA, how SGMA is being implemented, what those plans look like. Recently, the GSP, the groundwater sustainability plans for all these agencies have just finished their review by DWR. And that can be interesting to look at to see how the state has, it's sort of an assessment of this is what you've done well, this is what you need to improve. It's a good gauge of how well those plans are actually designed to meet the goals of making sure we're managing our groundwater in a way that's sustainable. Hopefully that kind of answers that question.
Thank you. Any other comments on kind of agriculture water use? Okay. We will move on. Question from Victoria. I've heard that we are going into or are in something like over 1,000-year drought based on historical evidence. Even a wet year or two wouldn't seem to change this prediction. Can you speak to this theory or the reality of that theory?
I can give that a shot. Yeah, I wish I would have read the study because I have seen that circulating recently as well. So I believe that was based on tree ring evidence and some modeling associated with that. If I'm not, I might be mistaken, but yeah, I guess the distinction here is that there's natural climate variability and there's anthropogenic climate change, and both of which are changing the climate as we speak, and they do it in tandem. So trying to isolate the anthropogenic piece of that is where some of these studies I think are especially useful and sort of like attribution science. And so it's true that there are prolonged longer periods of drought based around how the earth is changing through not just hundreds but thousands of years. And so that's definitely true that I think yeah, a single wet year wouldn't change that. But I think the bigger picture is looking forward with what I think the point that I would like to make is that really around the infrastructure and the management that the royal we in the Western US have constructed the last 50-100 years is based on a climate that is no longer true for really conditions now or the future. And so I think that that's really where kind of more of the focus needs to be, and less on sort of the interannual changes that we experience now, although that's important for our current reality. But I think more preparation, looking towards this change in like a quote unquote new normal is needed.
And I'll say, from a water supply perspective, and when you look at that study, they talk about how we're currently in a mega drought that started back in 2000. I mean, the effect of this drought on water supplies, as an example, I mean, it varies from system to system. And, I think what Erica's talking about, and you heard from Annabelle, I mean, are you a rain-fed system? Are you a snow-fed system? Are you a very diverse, system? The impact of these mega droughts really depends largely on how your system was built out. And I think what, Erica showed and Annabelle as well, and, I was talking about what East Bay MUD is doing. Part of the solution is regional collaborations and looking at the existing infrastructures, how you can connect it, looking at recycled water, looking at groundwater. For example, for East Bay MUD, like when we do have those wet years, can we recharge the groundwater basin that we can then use in drier years? So these are the strategies that I think we're all looking at how to do. And then, even the forecast informed reservoir operation that Erica talked about, how can we be smarter about our existing infrastructure and these rules that were built 50, 60 years ago that just don't make sense today?
Great, thank you. All right, a few more questions here. This may be a policy question. If anyone has a comment on, given the climate change and water, potential water issues, is it irresponsible for California to be requiring more housing? So we all know we have a housing crisis. Any comments on sort of the balance between resources like water and requirements for housing?
You
go ahead.
Okay, I'll just quickly, because we get that question a lot. And, when we do our water supply planning, just for people to understand, we look at every city, we serve, 20 incorporated, 15 unincorporated communities. We look at the general plans of all those communities. We look at the water demands going out to 2050. We look at all the other water demands for environmental flows, for fishery flows, and then we look at our water supply and we build our water supply portfolio to balance that. And what we looked at is, can we supply all this construction, all this development? And from a policy perspective, what Director Young and the board members, what level of rationing will we ask our customers to do in our design drought? And and within the plan that we adopted, that was 10%. So with all our portfolio, we would ask our customers to conserve 10%. And so we do look at what that future would look like, including the effects of climate change, as we look at how we build our resilient portfolio and that build out, and to deal with, I think as Heather noted, the affordability problem with housing.
Mute, I guess. I would just also add from, the perspective of an elected official is that as a water agency, our job isn't, we get what housing comes to supply, but just as you can, create a vehicle that doesn't rely on very much energy, and you can build a building that is, net carbon zero. You can build housing that is very, very water efficient. It's actually much more difficult to make existing buildings water efficient than it is, new construction. So I think if we're smart about the future, and I think as both Erica and Annabelle talked about, really taking a more holistic, approach that, it's not an either or scenario.
And I'll just add, I wanted to share, I have a couple reports I'll share in the chat, but we published a report specifically on urban growth and groundwater management in the San Joaquin Valley in September of last year. And I would just echo what Clifford and Marguerite have shared here, and that California's population has consistently grown and our per capita water use has essentially declined in a way that's kind of kept our residential water use pretty even over time. And there's a lot of ways that in building, or at least in building urban developments in the Central Valley, or cities end up being able to use water sometimes the most efficiently. And in building out those communities, they have to account for how they're going to supply water to those areas. And there's actually some interesting synergies that can work that we have suggested and recommended between city and urban agencies in the Central Valley as those communities grow, mainly like Fresno and Bakersfield, and the smaller communities and agriculture communities in the vicinity of those areas. So it can actually, in some ways, I think, be a nice opportunity too. But I'll share both. I'll share that report as well as the report we did on groundwater management in the Valley and Sigma in the chat.
Great, thank you all for those great comments. Another question here, if the panel could address the difference between meteorological drought, I like stumble over my words, and hydrological drought. And then what meteorological excess would be required to mitigate the hydrological table? And maybe you can define those words for us as well.
Well, I mean, a meteorological drought is when you just have extended dry periods of, say rainfall or precipitation. A hydrologic drought is when, you have extended meteorological drought that ends up with low water supplies or low groundwater levels, at the most basic level. And, what type of meteorological conditions do you need to get out of your hydrologic drought depends a lot on how your system is built out. Whether you're snow-fed, rain-fed, groundwater combination.
Thank you. I think we'll have time. Jay, cut me off if we need to wrap up soon. But a few more questions we'll try and get through. The panel doesn't mind sticking around for another few minutes. How can or should cities or developed areas change in order to be more climate adaptable regarding water use, runoff, etc.? Any thoughts on that topic? I think you guys all hit a lot of potential future thinking items. So if you think of anything else, let us know. A couple more questions. How can we advocate for more residential subsidies for water catchment and landscaping that is less water intensive to help recharge groundwater versus create more runoff? Any thoughts, maybe Clifford, on any advocacy we can do for additional subsidies?
I don't know if I can answer that one. I don't know, Director, do you have an idea on that one?
Well, our EBMUD, if you're looking very, locally, we actually have a fairly robust program for different kinds of water conservation that you can do. The thing about water catchment, at least locally, is that you have to build. If you think about the two atmosphere, if our rain's going to come in atmospheric rivers, and you think about the kind of system that you would need to have around your house to catch that water, it would be many, many thousands of gallons. And you'd have, it's more, a 50-gallon rain barrel doesn't do very much in our climate. It's great in Seattle or a place that gets rainfall throughout the year and has intermittent dry periods, because then you can, extend your water. You can use that water later when things dry out. Here, all of our rainfall comes between October or hopefully between October and April, mid-May, somewhere around in there. And so, 1,000 gallons of rainwater. And I have a couple of friends who have very large rainwater catchment systems at their homes. They can extend, their season for not needing irrigation actually through the summer, but they have big tanks all around their house. And they have landscaping and other things that promote, water holding. There is more we can do. I think we're looking at, actually, we've just added to our water conservation program some super rebates for, doing more native planting, putting in berms and other kinds of landscaping features to collect and hold water, as well as we have a gray water program. So I think there's there will be more that we do. There'll be more that becomes cost effective, as we continue on into the, into the next period, I think.
Thank you. We had a comment about the gray water delivery system. Not sure if there was a question there or if anyone had a comment on that, and maybe similar to what you were just speaking to, Marguerite, using cisterns or other sort of household ways we can be managing our collection of water at home. So I think you kind of touched on that.
Yeah, gray water is like laundry to landscape, or reusing your shower water, some of which are more require more regulatory complications, but we actually do gray water workshops. You can look on our website and learn about how to do that. But more efficient washing machines make gray water harder because we use less water in the washing machine. So
I have maybe one philosophical comment about this topic that is just based on personal view. I think even though some of these strategies, say, are really, in our situation would have a lesser impact, say, compared to ag or sort of large scale water management infrastructure, I think it's nice when there's sort of a mentality shift at the individual level or like community level, when folks are thinking about where their water comes from or concerned about their conservation of electricity, of water, of where their food comes from, all these things. I think that kind of permeates into our actions, as a greater group of humans. And so, yeah, I've got that question a lot too, where it's like, well, would this really matter? And I think sort of in a philosophical way, I think it does. I think it matters how we interact with each other and how we interact with the environment. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, things like composting and using compost in your yard saves water. People don't necessarily think about that, but that's exactly what it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point.
Yeah, those are great points. All right, couple last questions here. Is there any work being done on utilizing less water for sewage and waste, and what alternative systems could look like in an urban setting?
Also, I just want to let you know, Clifford's computer decided to do an automatic reboot. Well, so that's why we lost him. I mean, we have, as a result of ultra low flow toilets that are taking over, we actually have, much less water wrapped around every flush than we used to. But I think if you're talking about larger scale use of composting toilets or, other things like that that are gaining traction in places like Australia, I think they're in our future. It's not, I think we're, 20 years ago, when we first started talking about recycled water, we had the whole toilet to tap issue that has pretty much gone into the background. Maybe Annabelle could speak to that, but there's much more acceptance of using recycled water now and even going towards potable reuse. But on the sewage side and composting toilets, I think we're kind of back where, in terms of popular, support and where the health department is, frankly, that we're at an earlier stage. But I think it makes sense to me that it's coming as a more regular, normalized thing in some, certainly in some places.
Elizabeth mentioned separate delivery for recycled and clean water, conserving good water for drinking. I don't know if that's.
Remember when Clifford talked about the 4,200 miles of pipe in the ground? What he didn't mention was that to replace a mile of pipe. It costs between $2 and $4 million. And so there's also the issue of gravity and pumping and energy costs for operations. So for our wastewater treatment plant, which is located at the bottom of the bay, at the foot of the bay, you can, move that water along, sort of basically the same elevation. You start pumping that water uphill and it becomes very, very, it's more expensive to treat it, to get it to the point where you can use it, even for using it for, irrigation. But then it's also the energy cost of pumping. So there's definitely a cost benefit ratio that comes into play for that. And we've got a master plan for recycled water that takes those things into account. But it's not as simple as every time you put a new water pipe in the ground to put a purple pipe in that might be used for recycled water, because it may just not, may not always work. Oh, looks like Clifford's back.
I'm not an expert in water recycling. I will say I've been to a water recycling plant and I've had a sip of some of that water, and it's potable, clean water. It's pretty incredible, and it's similar technology to what people want from desalination plants too. It's using way less energy. It's way more economically affordable. I think like right now there's still a lot of non-potable uses. You can still use it to recharge groundwater, and so those are good things to use, but it'll be interesting to see how public opinion, I think, and perception of that continues to shift, because we have really, really, really good systems and technology that can filter that water and make it completely cleaner than it would come out of the ground. So
I apologize for dropping off. My computer decided to restart. So
No problem. I think I just had a couple more questions, but we'll wrap up here soon. Elizabeth is trying to start a NorCal versus SoCal war in the chat, asking about attitudes in water conservation. I don't know if anyone can speak to that. If you have any data, Annabelle, on attitudes, or if anyone has a comment. I'm sure it's quite difficult to manage all the stakeholders within our diverse state.
I mean, I can tell you, if you look at the conservation numbers at the end of last year, East Bay MUD was hitting, I think, almost close to 15% conservation by November. I was looking at the numbers earlier today. And in comparison, a lot of like the SoCal agencies were like barely conserving, maybe like 1 or 2%. I think that because Southern California had the Colorado River water supply in the last drought, they feel the impacts of drought differently. Their supplies are not as vulnerable in certain ways. And I know especially like San Diego has, different agencies have different opinions, I think, about when they've made like big investments in their water supply resiliency, and they've built big recycling plants, they've built big desal plants. I think then they struggle to ask their customers to conserve more when they've already made all these investments with this pitch that they're not going to have, that this is going to bolster their supplies. I think a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about that. So I won't take a stance either way, but it is true that Southern California is not conserving, at least now, in the way that other parts of the state are. And there's some conflicting opinions about how that should be going forward.
I'll be a little bit of I will be a contrarian on this, is that since the 70s, Southern California actually has the same as Northern California. I mean, it's largely a myth that Southern Californians are less conservation oriented than Northern Californians. Metropolitan Water District uses less water per capita than they did in the 1970s. I think, what, Annabelle, what you're talking about may be true in the more recent cycle, but I think overall Southern California is actually led in many respects in terms of water use efficiency and conservation, certainly ahead of some Central Valley communities, and actually much of Northern California, which hadn't experienced real drought very much. So I think we like to poke our Southern California neighbors, but I think some of it's pretty unfair.
Yeah,
I should actually add to, like, I was in recent, like last year, there's many Southern California agencies that have conserved more than 10% too. So if you remember that map I showed, there's a lot of blue dots in the South Coast as well. So I should add that as well.
And I won't feed into a Northern California, Southern California war. I mean, East Bay mud, we've also used less per capita today than we did in the 70s. And I think what the state did in the 2013 drought, where they wanted everybody in the state to save, 15% mandatory or whatever that number was. And now they've been a little more thoughtful about, looking at local conditions. I mean, different agencies have invested in different levels of drought resilience. And, we have to think about, for East Bay mud, our customers invested over $500 million to build our drought resilience. And, and that was so that our customers didn't have to conserve more than 10% in, unless we got to the most extreme droughts. And if we just come across and just say, all of California, you need to conserve 15 or 20%, the question is, why did we invest all this money in this infrastructure? And so I can't speak to every different water agency, but, the state has been very good about considering local conditions and not, and just thinking about what a local agency might have done versus just a broad brush, let's treat the entire state as one monolithic unit.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna ask one last quick question and then we'll let everyone get on with their evening. Jeff put a question in the chat. Maybe Clifford, to you, thinking about projections on sea level rise. Any thoughts on the wastewater plant location there by the Bay Bridge?
Yeah, sea level rise poses lots of problems, not just to the wastewater plant by the bridge, but also it could impact the delta, the levees, where we have infrastructure going across that, conveys those 3 aqueducts I talked about. We did look at the effects of sea level rise on the wastewater plant, projecting out to 2050 and 2100. And, most of our infrastructure there is not going to be affected by the projections that we've seen. But across the delta, there are certainly concerns, and we're looking about how we can harden our infrastructure across the delta, because if the delta levees fail, that could be harmful to our aqueducts. So, lots of issues with sea level rise, and then assuming that there are homes actually that aren't completely inundated that we can serve water to, higher sea levels bring salinity to our water distribution pipelines, which increases corrosion of our pipes and shortens the life. I mean, there are lots of things about sea level rise that we're looking at and understanding what we can do to harden our infrastructure.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your time and the great conversation and presentations. Really appreciate it. Jay, anything else on your end to share with the group?
Yeah, no, I just want to join you in thanking our panelists, Clifford Chan, Annabelle Rosser, Siirila-Woodburn. Thank you, Director Young, for joining us tonight as well. This was an amazingly, at least for those of us, myself at least, who are not regularly immersed in this field, immensely educational discussion tonight, and I want to thank you all for that. I also want to thank Heather for doing a great job moderating our panel tonight. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Julie Johnson and Zondale Christian on the CCI committee, as well as several other DIA board members who helped put this together. So, and lastly, thank you to all of our attendees who joined us tonight. I hope you found this as insightful as we have. So, thank you again.
Thank you
so much.
Have a good night.
Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.